let's talk about a stage of our painting that I like to call painting wet on dry. And this is a technique that anytime you hear me say something like creating an edge, I'm talking about painting wet on dry, because when we paint with wet paint on dry paper, we have a lot more control. When we painted this small scale wet on wet in our rose, we were also painting wet on dry, because only one part of our painting were we working wet on wet. Where the paint touched the dry paper, we got this edge here, the edge of the petal, and that was our painting wet on dry. So we were doing almost a little bit of both. And that's why most of the time when people talk about painting wet on wet, they're talking about wetting down your whole paper and letting things flow. But any technique that you can do on a large scale, you can also do on a small scale. And so this time we're going to talk about painting wet on dry, or creating edges. And really this is just, to me, I just think of it as painting, because you know, if you're not painting on wet, you're painting wet on dry. That's just how it is. And so we're going to start to build the shapes of our pansies here. And with the pansies, again, the wet on wet beginning is very uncontrolled. So here we've got this pansy that's kind of burst past the borders. The pencil line is here, but because our edge has flowed out, this is why we wanted to keep our pencil lines light. So now I can work with what's actually happening on the paper. I can change my plan slightly to make this work just a little bit better. So I'm going to find an edge. I'm going to paint the edge of one petal right here. And with my wet paint on the dry paper, the paint stays where I put it. So you can see that line. And what I like to do is I very rarely will just paint a simple solid shape on dry paper like this. Most of the time I will paint that shape and then I will soften it by using a damp brush with just a little bit of water on it to move that color, to pull that color out, and to soften that shape just a little bit. So now I'm getting a petal that follows that flow, but I'm also getting some beautiful wet on wet style softness that gives, that blends everything together. Makes it a lot harder to tell what I painted at what stage. And now that this area is damp, I can treat it like wet on wet by dotting in additional color. Maybe I want to do the center of a pansy quite a bit darker right there and let that color bleed. I'm actually going to lighten that because I didn't like that darker edge there. And then I might work on this petal over here. Again, where that wet paint meets the dry paper, I keep my crisp line. And then where I want things to flow, I use a damp brush to add a little water and move that color around. You can go back to that rich purple and continue that beautiful little pansy face. And go right around my whole flower that way. Make sure that you spent a little bit of time studying pansies, studying the shape of the petals. Pansies usually have 5 petals, and I've got one that's kind of hidden behind the others here that I'll have to paint in 2 stages. And they usually have like a larger petal, one that's kind of like a bib under the, they'll have one kind of like a bib under the flower, then 2 kind of on the side, almost like, I don't know, shoulders or something, and then a little one kind of tucked away at the back. So right away you see that flower come to life. You do not need to paint every detail to make your painting work. I think originally I used lemon yellow, so I'm going to use that same yellow to add a little bit of vibrance right in the center. And that gives it just a little bit of a glow there. And you can see I've brought that shape to life. Now over here with my leaves, I can do the same thing. Everything's very indistinct, so I can look for the shape of a leaf. And you can follow your drawing or you can disregard it. If your wet area has kind of developed, evolved in such a way that it changes your plan, feel free to change your plan, to ignore those pencil lines and to redefine your painting by what's happening in the wet and wet areas. And now I've got a leaf, and it was just creating that crisp line on one side. I painted half of the leaf, then I flowed the color softly to kind of bleed it and create a beautiful flow in my painting that marries the wet and wet background with the detail in the foreground, in the second layer. I'm going to do this pansy next, and I'm going to do the same wet on dry technique, painting that first section with a nice crisp line and then using just a slightly damp brush. It's not dripping wet, but it has enough moisture on it that it's not going to act like a sponge and suck up the color I've placed. It's just going to move it down the painting. And this has a yellow center, so I want that to continue. I want to keep that yellow. So I'm not painting the violet all the way down. I'm going to go back with the yellow. Yellow and violet are tricky because they are complementary, so that means where the yellow and violet meet, they could create kind of a murky neutral color. So I try not to stir them around. I try to let them do their mixing kind of organically, and then they're much more likely to kind of keep their own identities, if that makes sense. As soon as I start stirring them around, I really go a long way to encouraging them to make their mud. And if I don't want mud, it's better just to let them blend on their own. And sometimes they'll blend in a way that's almost side by side, where they complement each other instead of neutralizing each other. So painting the shape, softening. I'm doing a quite a controlled stage, so I'm choked up on my brush, so all you see I have a lot more control when my hand is right down at the base of my brush like this. I'm going to rinse my brush so I don't have any violet on it, and then instead of adding more yellow at this stage, I'm actually going to take this yellow and pull it down a little bit, spread it out a little bit before adding more yellow. Now I'm going to add a little bit more. And I like that, actually, what's happening there with those colors, the way they bleed together. It's creating some very interesting effects that I think are going to be really beautiful to see. Right now, I'm going to actually wait before I paint the other petals. I'm going to give this color a chance to settle before I paint these two petals. So I'm going to move to this flower here, which I wanted it to be a yellow. And it's a little blossom that hasn't quite opened. So I'm going to just quickly follow the shape in yellow. Here, the first layer of yellow that I placed, it bled so softly and quickly and kind of in a light way that I can just follow the shape of my original drawing. I don't have to reinvent anything. And I am going to darken, give it some purple right at the base, and then there's going to be some green there where the stem holds the flower up. So that one's basically done. Don't need to do anything else there. Don't feel like you have to paint every detail in every petal. Sometimes all you need to do is just find an edge, flow a little bit of color. The deal with detail is it draws the eye there. It says this is something the artist felt was important. So areas that aren't as important need to have less detail, or your viewer won't really know what they should be looking at. So I'm just finding again that edge, the edge of the petal, and letting the color flow inward from there. And this flower is looking quite a bit more soft and delicate than this flower, based on how much violet I used. Remember that with color in watercolor, we lighten our colors by adding water. We do not need to add white to lighten the color. We just add more water and it gets paler and shows more transparently on the paper. With this one I'm working on right now, I'm doing the same treatment as I did over here, only there's a few dry spaces, and you just like I said before, Whenever you have dryness on your paper, the paint really doesn't want to go there. It has to be very wet indeed for the color to flow onto dry paper. Water tells the paint where to go, tells it how to move. So by leaving a few white spaces in my painting, I leave some gaps for where color's not going to go. And I think I'm going to go back to this one here. It's not completely dry, but once the color is kind of settled in, soaked into the paper, it's not going to move nearly as much. And so I can start working it again with my color and not worry too much about things bleeding, color moving it more than I want it to. Look how much that yellow's flowed down into this petal. If we decide we want to have less yellow, I might add more violet. The violet's such a dark color, it will cover the yellow quite well. And I can kind of push that yellow back and make it less dominant. The deal, though, is that we don't always have to do that. Actually, having so much yellow flowing out could make this flower just so beautifully dynamic in the painting that we might decide we don't want to cover any of it up. There's a little petal in the back. It's not very important, so it's going to be not very distinct from the rest of the flower. It's a poor neglected petal. And I'm going to add some yellow to my pansy. If you're painting along with me in this lesson, I'd love to see what you've done. Feel free to post your work in my Angela Fehr watercolor workshop on Facebook. In my paid online courses here on learn.angelafehr.com, there are student galleries where you can post your work and receive coaching and critiques from me. I love sharing insight into how to strengthen your paintings, what works and what doesn't, in a kind and encouraging way that's tailored for your skill level. And I love sharing that in my student galleries on my paid online courses. So that is one of the benefits in enrolling in one of my online classes here at learn.angelafehr.com. There really is no substitute for personal instruction, so I do try to make it as personal as I can through this online format. This flower is kind of facing away from the viewer, and if you're not seeing it in your sketch, when I teach this class locally, sometimes when you start flowing the color across the paper in that wet and wet layer, sometimes it changes the shape of the flower, and that's okay. Just work with look up some pansies online, study their shapes, and then do something, paint it in a way that works for what's happened in your fluid wash. You can always change it and diverge from the original sketch. When you're painting materials supplied by your instructor, you're painting what's in my head, not what's in yours. So that can be really challenging. So any way that you can change it up and make it your own will make it a stronger painting in the end. That's also one reason why art instructors encourage students not to submit workshop projects to online sites, to competitions, or to sell the work. Most of the time, you're much better off creating work that is yours from the very first idea right down to completion. And have confidence that you will get to the point where you can create art that you're proud to share with the public as being authentically your own. Okay, right now I'm going to just work a little bit more on the leaves. Again, finding that one edge. I always like to just start with one edge. And these leaves have kind of almost a heart-shaped feel to them. And then with a damp brush, flowing that color out. And the more you practice this technique, it's really such a broadly used technique. Adding that line and then softening and moving the color The more skill you build with that, it will really pay off, because it is a technique that just gets so used. And I'm going to add a little bit of violet to this one. Let that color flow. Give it a little bit of a wet and wet effect over there. Use some of that violet over there just to get the start of a leaf. And look how that little line shape just looks like a leaf without me doing anything more to it. I'm going to put a tiny bit more green in it, but I'm actually going to leave it because I kind of like that shape. It's pretty and pleasing. The brush I'm using here, this is an Escoda Versatile number 10 rigger brush, and it's a very soft brush. The bristles are very soft. It's made to mimic the feel of sable brushes, and I like it because it's got such long bristles. You'll notice that I paint, when I want detail, I paint with the very point of my brush where I can get the fine detail, but a lot of times I'm painting with the side of my brush, and I get a much more interesting shapes when I'm swooping my brush along with the side of the brush instead of trying to paint all these shapes kind of mechanically from my own skill set. The brush kind of takes over when you're using the side of the brush, and you get this beautiful, organic, natural line. Up here where I have some stems, I just carefully pull downward. And I try to do a stem, anytime I'm painting a line, I try to do it all in one fluid stroke. Even if you run out of paint, then at least you have a damp line and you can add a little bit of color into it. Because if you're painting it in short little strokes, often it's kind of gets this choppy, fuzzy look to it. So I paint the shape I want, and then I dot in a little bit of color into that moist line that I've just created. Over here I can also use some green to define the shape of my flower, and that can make the flower just pop a little bit more, especially if I go a little darker around the edge. It's going to define that petal. And where where this leaf is dry, you can see these lines stay nice and crisp. Over here, I can paint a line that gets very soft because this area is still damp. If the dry strokes over here seem too dominant, then I go back with my damp brush and I soften them again. It's this come and go, hard and soft effect. Sometimes I'll call it a lost and found edge. You create a line and then you soften portions of it so it's not so dominant. Up here, where the stem touches the flower, I've got, again, some small leaves attaching in here. They're going to bleed a little bit into this wet petal and cause that to look, everything to look connected there. And I want that stem to stand out a little bit better too. This one doesn't have a stem, does it? Try to imagine it coming from the center of the flower and then follow the way it would go. Sometimes if it curves, it still is coming from the center. So you could curve from there and then move your hand in the direction the stem would move and then touch it down when you reach the place where you need to start painting. Really all this little painting needs right now is maybe a few defining lines, and final details can really give your painting that finished feeling. So we're going to let them dry completely and then go in and I'll show you just what I mean by painting final details and how much detail you should add. With our rose painting right here, we're going to do a very little bit in adding detail to it. Not very much. I'm going to save that for our final detail lesson as well.